be reading from Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50, if you'd like to turn there with me. Otherwise, the verses will be on the screens behind me. One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And behold, a woman of the city, who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner." And Jesus answered, said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." And he answered, "Say it, teacher." A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he cancelled the debt of both. "Now which of them will love him more?" Simon answered, "The one, I suppose, for whom he cancelled the larger debt." And he said to him, "You have judged rightly." Then turning towards the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little." And he said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." Then those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" And he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace."
Thanks, Dan. Well, morning, everybody. If we've not met before, I'm JP. I'd love to meet you after the service. And hey, wasn't last week Nation Sunday incredible? So much fun. Just the joy, the worship, the celebration, interviewing those different leaders from different nations and sort of how their leadership and culture kind of joined together. And the food, I mean, wasn't that glorious? So hands up if you've tried something you've not tried before last week. Yeah, a fair few of us amongst us. The outfits as well. And I don't know how many of you spotted someone so committed to the cause, dressed up as an Irish leprechaun, like a blow-up Irish leprechaun. I looked across and I was like, what on earth is that? So I love the way that we're family together. But if you went around, feel free to have a look at photos on social media. If you do me a favor, ignore the one of me. Once again, I found a photo of myself in action where I look excessively stern. I don't know, there's a problem with my face. I just need to kind of smile a little bit more every time I make a comment, whatever it is. But there we go. But one of the fun things of last week, real highlight, I thought, was the way Marv preached in starting this series. Just thought it was absolutely brilliant. And kicking the Meals with Jesus series off and just really helping us to get it. Yeah, like really get what all this is about and why we do it. And it's actually that theme of getting it that our next story that Dan just read to us from Luke chapter 7 picks up upon. And I like to call it the Pharisees, the feet, and the forgiven, just so it's a bit more exciting. But what you've got to remember about this story is that this is a story about two people. And deliberately, they are set up as a contrast. There's a contrast going on. Only one of them truly gets it. I wonder if you spotted that as Dan read it out. And we see in the story Jesus is invited to the house of a Pharisee. We don't know why he invited Jesus over, whether he particularly respected him or was somewhat intrigued by him. Maybe even he wanted to bring some kind of correction to Jesus. He started out in his teaching. But what we do know is that to share a meal with someone in that culture was to, in some ways, identify with them, to associate with them. And so it's unlikely that his intentions were all bad. And it says that this guy was a Pharisee, which I'm sure lots of us will know as one of the Jewish religious leaders of the time. But There's so much more that we can know that can really help us to see what it is that's going on in this story. Because I suppose our job as we read the New Testament is really to try and sort of open up something of that world to see what was going on, to understand the context in which it was written. Now, a few months ago, there was a trend on social media, wasn't there, where wives asking husbands, "How often do you think about the Roman Empire?" And as Ruby has demonstrated, the trend got traction because there was so much shock at the frequency with which said husbands answered it, probably every day. Like, what? But I suppose something of the Christian answer actually is that every time we open the New Testament, we are gazing into the world of the Roman Empire and cultures within it. And as we do, what we would see here is that it wasn't just that the Romans occupied the land in which the Jewish people lived, but they did so extraordinarily insensitively. So fewer than 100 years ago, for instance, there had been a Roman general. His name was Pompey, different to Pompeii, where Vesuvius erupted, who had quelled an uprising in Jerusalem, robbed the Jews of their independence of governance, and then just to really frustrate them, had waltzed into the most precious place, the most holy place in the Jewish temple. So they absolutely loathed these Romans. And they then faced a question as to how do we relate to these Roman people? Which really is a question that any occupied nation has to answer, isn't it? And in Jesus' day, there were several answers, I suppose. The first one is, well, we could just work with them and trust that God's blessing will come as we do. And that's what it was a political party, really, the Sadducees did. So they held all of the leadership positions. They made up the Jewish leadership council. They're like, we'll work with them and just hope that God blesses us in the midst of it. Another one said, well, we can just remove ourselves because these Romans, all they're doing is so impure. We've got to get out of here. And so this was the party of the Essenes. They went over to the east from Jerusalem, over to the Dead Sea, a place called Qumran, and they settled their own community there. It's a much more sort of pure place because it's just us obeying the law. But then others said, well, why don't we fight them? And this was the party known as the Zealots, and Jesus had one of them amongst his disciples, didn't he? Simon the Zealot, who thought, come on, God's on our side, so let's fight them. And actually, when the Jewish temple came crumbling down as a result of the Romans, a war amongst the Romans and the Jews, it was the Zealots really that caused that. But then there was one final option, and that is, well, we could stick around, but just desperately try and maintain our Jewish identity, our purity. And this was the option of the Pharisees. This is what they believed in. It was a grassroots movement that said, look, if we can just be the purest that we can be, if we can obey the law down to the very last letter, then God will see our purity. He will bless us. His kingdom will come. And of course, that will mean the Romans have to get kicked out. And so they did things like they would give the interpretation to the law as much authority and weight as the law itself, really just to try and remove the ambiguity, because they were purity obsessed. They're desperate for the kingdom to come. They think, come on, we've got to do it. We've got to obey the rules. The trouble was that these guys, the Pharisees, had forgotten that this law only came because the privilege of a relationship with God. Actually, for them, the rules had become dominant. The grace and mercy of God to take a wayward people and give them his promises, it just toppled from the forefront of their minds. And what it meant was that they had loads of power, but actually loads of pride. And it meant that they had loads of clarity, but only a little love. And it meant that in Jesus, they had the fulfillment of all of God's promises right in front of them, and yet they didn't get it. They missed it. They got frustrated. They got angry with Jesus. He didn't meet their expectations. And we could say, oh, silly old Pharisees, but don't you find that's our experience too sometimes? That sometimes we get angry with God, don't we? Sometimes we get frustrated that he's not done what we think he should have done. Or we feel lost in confusion. Maybe you feel like God's being unfair. Maybe even sometimes we can feel like God owes us one. And actually, you don't even have to be a Christian to think like that. I find even in conversations with people exploring faith, someone said to me once, I don't believe in God because I'm angry at him. Or you say, oh, well, if that is true, if that's what God's like, well, then that's unfair. And we're just pleading with these people. I think if he's God, we don't get to judge. We get to dance to his tune. And for this Pharisee, the reason, as we will see, that he felt like this was that he just didn't get it. He was seeking God, but he couldn't grasp the gospel, the good news of Jesus. He couldn't compute when those who didn't play by the rules that he taught and he interpreted seemed to be blessed by Jesus. Now, we too live in a reward culture, don't we? Society works on we're assessed on the basis of what we do or don't do, aren't we? We easily see that we're strivers and self-justifiers. Two of the most common statements of our culture. I've worked hard for this, and you deserve it. And so it's little surprise then that there's times when we get frustrated at the activity of God because we look to our own merit. We too sometimes try to dictate the play, don't we? We too forget that God's blessing on someone else does not lessen his ability to bless us too. We seek God, and yet sometimes we forget the gospel. I'm not saying that we're hypocritical like the Pharisees. I'm not saying that Jesus is angry at us or that we're doing a bad job following him or anything. I'm just saying that sometimes when I look at the state of my own heart, when I see my own thoughts, sometimes I see pride and self-reliance. Sometimes I see dismissiveness and prejudice. Sometimes I see Pharisaism. And I suspect that if you're honest, sometimes you do too. Now, it's precisely because this Pharisee, this lawkeeper, this purity enthusiast, because they were his values, that's why he reacted so strongly to this woman. She was a prostitute. We don't know the background to that, why that was the case, but certainly for sex workers today, well, a 2016 Houses of Parliament report referred to extensive experiences of abuse and violence and very high levels of drug addiction. And the Jericho Road Project here in Nottingham are doing a wonderful job of showing the love of Jesus to the estimated 75 on-street sex workers in Nottingham and over 200 off-street, behind closed doors, women that affects. But what we do know about the time is that it wasn't unusual that this lady was at this house. Because in the first century, particularly for larger houses in Israelite villages, they often would have had these peripheral areas around the house where people could gather. They were much less private than our sort of secure castles that we have today. And so she and others in sort of, the Bible gives it the general category of the poor, if you like, perhaps they were there to honor the invited guest. Maybe they were intrigued by him, or maybe sometimes the owner of the house would feed them in order to be seen as benevolent, and so they would gather there. They could watch the party from a distance, maybe sometimes even hear the conversations that were going on. But in an environment tightly controlled by social etiquette, they certainly couldn't come to the table. And what they would have seen as they looked on would have been a U-shaped couch with a table in the middle. So like the couch around three sides of the table, the fourth being free so the food could be served. And they would see the table guests lying on their left-hand side on their elbow with their feet behind them reclining, feet away from the table and sandals off. And it says in the story that along comes, verse 37 describes her as this woman of the city. This sinner by reputation, this ritually unclean one, into the heart of this purity-obsessed Pharisees' banquet. She's weeping. She stands behind Jesus and she begins to let her tears fall onto his dirty, exposed feet. But she stays there. She doesn't seem to be moving. She's starting to get close to Jesus, intimate even. And then she does something truly shocking. She undoes her hair and lets it down. And with it, she begins to wipe his now tear-soaked, grime-stained feet. Now, I said this was a story of contrast. And it's here where the intended action and the perception of what was going on are at polar opposites in the room. You see, for the Pharisees and others in the house, if a woman let her hair down in public in the Middle East in the first century, that was seen as a sexually enticing act. In fact, one of the commentators, Joel Green, goes as far as to say that it was akin to going topless in public. The Jewish rabbis at the time said that if a wife let her hair down in public, that was grounds for divorce. That's how it would have been seen. And then to rub her hair on a man's body would be interpreted by most in the room as a sexual advance. But she knew, and Jesus knew, that what she was actually doing was expressing her complete devotion to him. She knew that Jesus would see and receive the most intimate aspects of her life. Not in a sexual way. Though in the Bible, sex is appointed to devotion, isn't it? But because he was safe for her. Because he was her hope. In fact, so much so that she didn't care how she came across. That in him there was something so wonderful that no one's disdain could get near. And Luke here is trying to record both. You know, her devotion and the Pharisees' horror at what he perceives is this impurity, this sensuality. And then to top it all, she takes this jar made of alabaster. It's like a soft rock, and it contains perfume. And when we hear a story like this, we can tend to think of something quite big, can't we? Like a vessel, like a water jug or something like that. We think she's here, she's brought a vat of liquid, and what's she about to do with it? But it's more profound than that. Actually, an alabaster jar was a small sealed jar that was worn as a necklace by women as an admittedly expensive beauty accessory. Worn around the neck. And in a hot pre-deodorant culture, the scent was seen to give women a pleasant aroma around them and be an illustration of their beauty. But of course, once it was broken, it was useless. And so what does she do? She takes this precious, costly thing from around her neck, the very thing that her livelihood depended upon. In fact, the summary to some people of all that she is she's just a nice scent, a pleasant experience. That's how she would have been seen by some people in the room. And she pours it, which means she would have had to break it, on the feet of the one who saw her as so much more than that. And she begins to kiss his feet unceasingly. Now just imagine for a minute that you are this rule-fervent Pharisee. You are desperate for God's kingdom to come, for the purity of your people to grow to such extent that he has to bless you. And now here this immoral, impure prostitute, as you are perceiving her, has broken all sorts of social etiquette, has disrespected you by waltzing into the heart of the banquet in your home, and now right in front of you, your narrative is that she is coming onto your honored guest. And he doesn't seem to be pushing her away. So how do you feel at this moment? Well, his reaction gives his heart away, doesn't it? It says in verse 39, it says, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, classic words of an introvert, isn't it? He said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who's touching him, for she's a sinner. And his reaction reveals two things. The first thing it reveals is utter disdain for this woman. He said, this is just what her type are like. Which, of course, is never our reaction towards anyone, is it? Is it? I'm not sure I can say that. I'm not sure those who are poor or those who've experienced racial abuse, for instance, or those part of any kind of minority can say that that sort of thing doesn't happen in the world, even the church. It's just what their type are like. But the second thing is that it raises a question in his mind. He's saying, if he knew He said, look, either he doesn't know, which means he's not a prophet, or he does know who she is and what she's like, and so he's not pure. Now, why is he thinking like that? What's going on in his mind that is leading him to have those thoughts? He's thinking like that because he thinks that sin is simply just disobeying the rules. Now, if you think that the rules are the route to the blessing, and you back your immersiveness in them and your keeping of them, well, then sin's just breaking them, isn't it? And this woman's wrong, and rule keeper, teacher that he is, he's in the right. It's like going to see a professional. Do you ever have this? Like you don't just feel like they know the rules better than you, but they also keep them better than you too. I don't know if you have that experience. Sometimes I wonder how teachers feel, for instance. It's parents' evening, and a parent rocks up who is themselves a teacher. And you think, oh, they're the worst. I bet they do all the paperwork and go way above and beyond. But sin is so much more than breaking the rules. Sin is what overflows from the heart. Sin is the desire to live independent of God. He's saying, I want to do it myself. Thank you. Ben put me onto this great podcast this week. It's called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And on it, it references an interview with Richard Dawkins, who perhaps epitomizes the new atheist movements. And the question was put to him, what, if anything, would make you believe in God? And he spouted out something like, I don't know, if somebody appeared with light around them and said, I am God, which sounds like the Transfiguration to me. But then he said, no, actually, I don't know if it would, because I don't want anyone else to be the author of my own life. I thought, how revealing. Sin is idolatry. I'll do it, thank you. The trouble is, as the late US pastor Tim Keller says, summing up the rules, there's a God and you're not him. We were created for dependency, weren't we? We can't just depersonalize God to a set of principles and ways that we think he should act. And seeing the reaction of this Pharisee, Jesus does two things. Firstly, he calls him by name, verse 14. Simon, I have something to say to you. And of course, here he's proving his role as a prophet. You know, Simon thinks he doesn't know her, else he would not be doing this. Actually, what Jesus is showing is not only does he know who she is, but he also knows who Simon is as well and what's going on in his mind. And points him the way to God. But then he tells him a story, secondly. He tells him a story. It begins in verse 41. It says, a certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii. A denarius was a day's wages, so 500 days' wages. And the other, 50. When they could not pay, he cancelled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he cancelled the larger debt. And he said to him, you've judged rightly. You see, if sin is just about obeying the rules, then Simon's done better than this woman, hasn't he? But it's more than that. It's deeper than that. Sin is about a heart, a life in a mess. He says it's like two debtors, and neither of whom could pay. Both of whom, per the culture of that time, would have been sent to prison if they could not pay their debt, or worse. He's saying both are in trouble. Both are in need. Think of it like this. There's two people who've died. One of them died peacefully in their sleep. The other was killed by a firing squad who put 100 bullets in their body. Now, which of them is more dead? It's both, isn't it? One might be peacefully dead and one might be brutally dead, but they are both dead. Neither of them can do anything about their deadness. He's saying, Simon, sin is like a debt that's owed. And when a debt is owed, regardless of the size, someone somewhere has to pay. And it's either the debtor by going into prison or being sold into slavery or death, or it's the lender who cancels it at great cost to themselves. Oh, and by the way, Simon, you're not the lender. It reminds me, When I was a lawyer, I used to have, sometimes people come to see me, and it would be a landlord, and they say, "My tenant is not paying their rent." So I'm very sorry to hear that. It's not an unusual experience, but you don't say that to them. Here's your options. Either you can do something that in some way enforces them to pay or has some consequence. You can put a court order in or whatever that gets to remove them from the house or something. Or you can absorb it yourself and forget about it. But either way, there's no magic middle. There's no pot for landlords who have tenants who will not pay their rent. Sometimes we think a bit like that about sin, don't we? Some like magic pot whereby suddenly it just disappears. But this woman, she knows her indebtedness. She knows the state of her heart. She knows her utter inability to do anything about it. She knows her need. But not only that, she knows her forgiveness. She knows that her debt has been paid, and thus she knows her freedom. And Jesus is saying to Simon, here you are, still trying to justify yourself, still trying to police God and tell me what to do, still refusing to accept your utter indebtedness, the desperate state of your heart. And yet, in your refusal to accept the severity of sin, you are robbed of the joy of knowing the depths from which you have been forgiven. Robbed of the joy of knowing the depths from which you have been forgiven. As a staff team recently, we've been trialing out what will be the next Theology Foundations course, which we'll launch in the autumn. Tim Bunker's heading it up, and it's brilliant. 2 sessions in, it's great so far. But the last one that we were doing was, it's all about looking at the doctrine of salvation. What does it mean for us to be saved? And so the last session was looking at sin. What is sin? And just really got us thinking. And off the back of that session, I suppose just been pondering various things we talked about in that. And I wrote these words, just trying to, I suppose, connect something of like the pervasiveness of sin. I wrote this. Sin is a power you can't overcome, a prison you can't escape, a morgue you can't walk out of. Sin is an addiction you can't break, a problem you can't solve, a disease you can't heal. Sin is a union you can't undo, a master you can't be free from, a weight you can't bear. Sin is a debt you can't pay, a chasm you can't cross, an ache you can't soothe. Sin is a reaction you can't prevent, a weakness you can't work on, a fire you can't extinguish. Sin is a monster, a destroyer, a hurricane. Who will deliver me from this body of death? Paul writes in Romans chapter 7. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. And this woman knew what Simon didn't, that in Jesus Christ is complete forgiveness of sin, is the gift of a new heart, a new identity that responds differently, and is the glad reception of our love. Yeah, I am a desperate sinner in need of the grace of God, and yet somehow, because of the cross, I am no longer called a sinner, I'm now called a saint. And if you know Jesus, so are you. Do you know the depths from which you've been forgiven? Do you know the offense that you caused? Do you know the filth of your character before Jesus came into your life? And if those questions cause offense in you, I want to plead with you to search your heart before the Holy One. But when you know those things, when you know the depths from which you've been forgiven, you do 3 things quickly to finish. Firstly, you go all in. You go all in. This Simon, he held back, didn't he? He judged, he depersonalized, he made a doctrinal exercise out of the whole thing. He created a religion devoid of intimacy. Do you ever do that? But this woman, well, Jesus says in verse 34, Simon, I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she's wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she's not ceased to kiss my feet. You didn't anoint my head with oil, but she's anointed my feet with ointment. See, this woman, she had alabaster faith. Do you remember that necklace, that expensive symbol of her life? What did she do with it? She poured it out on Jesus. She gave everything. She held nothing back. How's that going for you right now? I wonder what your alabaster necklace equivalent is. The thing that characterizes your life. I wonder what you're doing with it. Storing it for safekeeping, perhaps. Showing it off. Proud that you've achieved enough to earn it in the first place. Well, this woman, she poured hers out on Jesus. And it meant that she danced to his tune. Whereas here's Simon still trying to make Jesus dance to his. Secondly, if you know the depths from which you've been forgiven, then you love lavishly. The parable ends on a cliffhanger, doesn't it? Even the story, like what was Simon's reaction? But you can well imagine it, can't you? You want me to kiss you too, Jesus? You want me to weep on you? You want my whole body and being? I wonder when was the last time that you wept because of the gospel? The depths from which you've been forgiven. When was the last time you knew intimacy with Jesus? When was the last time you did something in spite of how it made you look to others? And yet we see in verse 47, Jesus says, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who's forgiven little loves little. And the Greek's quite clear there, that the woman's not forgiven because she loved Jesus. No, she loves Jesus because she's been forgiven. It's a done deal, right? Like slate white clean. Identity changed. Adoption enacted. Salvation won. She loved lavishly. It says in verse 50 that she walked in peace. And then finally, when you know the depths from which you've been forgiven, you get defined by Jesus. Now, this word Pharisaism, it just means separated one. It's a beautiful idea, one separated for God. And yet, here it is now stained with pride and self-righteousness, arrogance and self-justification. I'm doing it. Look how I'm obeying the rules. Look at my achievements, my respect, my rightness. Look at my position, my wealth, my learning. I've done well. Our culture doesn't say any different, does it? I will define myself. Thank you very much, it says. It's only the woman who says, just look at the depths from which I've been forgiven. Just look at my peace. Just look at my Savior. See, I think if we're honest, there's a little bit of Pharisaism in all of our hearts, isn't there? But if you want to get it, come to Jesus. Remember the depths from which you've been forgiven. Remember what it cost. Remember how it changed your status, your life. Remember how it gave you your freedom. Remember there's a God and you're not him. But by grace, you are now joined to him forever. Why don't we stand? Let's have the band.